Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a number of lasting impacts, and one of those is fewer people working in downtown office buildings.
And a lot less foot traffic, which hurts retail shops, restaurants, and other businesses downtown. And that has been a problem for years. But it could be a long-term blow to the city's budget as well.
That's because much of Boston's tax revenue comes from commercial property taxes. Empty offices in downtown could lead to a drop in commercial real estate value, which in turn could cause tax revenues to fall short.
And a recent report suggests Boston could lose up to $1.4 billion in tax revenue over the next few years.
Now, the Wu administration is watching this closely and last week introduced legislation to address it. Joining us to talk all this through is Greg Maynard of the Boston Policy Institute. That group, in coordination with Tufts University, put together the report on fiscal fallout from Boston's empty offices. And Ashley Groffenberger, the City of Boston's Chief Financial Officer. Thanks, both of you, for being here. We sure appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, let's talk with you, Greg, first, and talk a little bit about different cities that have dealt with this. We know New York, San Francisco have dealt with the fallout from COVID. What makes Boston vulnerable like those cities?
So the thing that's happening in Boston is it's not that Boston has a weaker office market or retail market than those other cities. The problem is that Boston has a really unique way that it raises local revenue. So there's really three things that are unique about it. The first one is Boston is way more reliant on property taxes overall than every other big city in the country. More than 70% of the city's revenue comes from property taxes. The second piece is that commercial property taxes represent a huge portion of that property tax revenue. So the numbers that we're using this last week is like almost 60% of the property tax revenue is from commercial property taxes. And then the third piece is that the city has become way more dependent on property tax revenue over the last 20 years. So back in the early 2000s, Boston's, the amount of the revenue they got from property taxes was only about 55%. It's now at over 70%. And that's mostly been grown on the back of the really big office boom that's happened in Boston over the last 20 years, right? Back in the early 2000s, the Seaport District hadn't been built yet. It's been built now. Mm-hmm. And so now the city is dealing with this issue that the driver of its budget growth over the last 20 years is no longer going to provide that growth. And what our report shows is that the city really needs to think seriously about how it moves forward, because the solutions they had in the past are not going to work moving forward. We need to really, kind of rethink how Boston grows its budget, whether that's through budget cuts or raising residential real estate taxes, or back in the early 2000s, the state used to give a lot more aid to Boston than it does now, and so those are kind of the three places that it could potentially come from.
So, Ashley, what's your reaction to the report and also to these ideas that we're not raising revenue in other ways that cities are?
Yeah, it's a great question. So. As you mentioned, this is an issue that the mayor, myself, and the city have been paying very close attention to for months now, as we've been, recovering from the COVID pandemic. And the report that Greg mentioned, it makes two key assumptions. One, that office values will fall, and two, that we will lose property tax revenue as a result of that. And I think it's really important to understand that the way property taxation works in the Commonwealth is that a decline in values does not equal a decline or a loss of revenue. But what it can impact is who is paying the share of that property tax levy. So state law allows us to increase our property tax 2.5% every year. Nothing about declining office values would impact our ability to raise that revenue year over year. But that being said, it could impact who is paying those taxes. And what the mayor introduced last week is a measure that would temporarily adjust the shift of who is bearing the burden of that tax levy to lessen the shock that it could have on residents, and allow us to really smooth in the impact of that over time. You mentioned our ability to raise other revenue. Of course, we're very limited here in the Commonwealth about what we can do locally. Mm-hmm. Greg mentioned that we have seen a decline in state aid over time, and that has led to a greater share of our budget being supported by property tax. But I think it's important to note that property tax is a very stable source of revenue for us, and we in Boston have enjoyed a AAA bond rating for the last 9 years. The rating agencies note the property tax stability is a reason for that rating. The The state, as part of the Municipal Modernization Act, has put forward some ability for states, municipalities to increase the amount of local excise tax that they're raising. So, we're anxious to see how that moves forward. So there's definitely pros and cons to that. Other cities during the pandemic saw, large revenue decreases because of their mix of revenue sources that Boston didn't experience. So again, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword with property tax.
Greg, you winced a little bit when she said something about, I think, about values and taxes.
Yep.
Do you want to react to that?
Yeah, so I think what's important to note here in our report is what the report says is that there's going to be $1.5 billion shortfall in commercial property tax revenue. And so what Boston does and what the mayor's proposal is addressing is that in Boston, the commercial property tax rate is 175% of the residential property tax rate, right? So like the commercial property tax pays like $25 per thousand versus like almost $11 per thousand on the residential side. And so we're saying that like the three options that we've laid out of kind of like what the city can do is you have to rebalance that basically. And so, and what we're kind of arguing is that as a sector, the office market, the office values are just not going to be what they were in the past. You're seeing that with how these buildings are trading now. You had another building that got sold over the last week that was at like 36% less than it was sold for back in 2005, right? Like that's not going in the right direction for talking about these issues. And so, I think it's really important to just note that like the commercial property tax stuff that we're looking at now, you're looking at a sector that is no longer healthy versus when this proposal was put forward 20 years ago by Mayor Menino, that's when this office sector was booming, right? Back then is when, that's before the Seaport was built, you had all these office buildings being built. So you had you did higher taxes on a healthy sector versus higher taxes on what's a really unhealthy sector, right?
Well, and Ashley, I want to give you a chance to respond to all of that, but also just that maybe this isn't all doom and gloom here. We have buildings that are being built and are filling up as well.
Right. I think, 2003, 2004 is a great example and exactly what we were modeling when we put forward the proposal we put forward today, last week about really, smoothing and moderating that impact in over time. I think there are some differences from 2003, 2004. We have some bifurcation in the commercial sector. You have brand new, beautiful office buildings that are opening downtown, but you have distressed buildings as well. And I think under the proposal we put forward, if you are the owner of a distressed commercial property, you will probably still see your taxes go down year over year, but maybe just not as fast. And likewise for residents, you could see your property taxes go up year over year, but again, not as fast. And so what we're really trying to do here is smooth in that impact and moderate the impact of this change for everyone.
Greg, in my experience with people I know who own office buildings and commercial property in Boston is they often go ask to have their tax rate lowered every single time. So one might make the argument that they weren't paying the amount of tax that they needed. I mean, legally it was fine. I'm not making any, but this is a process, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we're looking at in the report is just that if you look at office vacancy, if you look at back to office in 2002, it was about 60%. It was about the same in 2023. And so remote work was not a thing that was happening prior to COVID, is now like a fact of life. And so, really what this report is emphasizing is not that Boston did anything wrong, right? This is part of a national, international trend. It's just that because of how Boston raises property tax revenue, it's just particularly vulnerable to this kind of dip in commercial values.
Ashley, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I do think there are challenges, and again, exactly why Mayor Wu was putting forward the measure that she put forward. Really, at the heart of this measure is protecting homeowners and protecting residents here in the city. The proposal is beneficial to those who own big apartment buildings and pass any of those increases on to their renters. So really, the heart of this is to protect residents and help kind of smooth in this new reality that we may be facing as a city.
Just quickly, the conversion idea of turning office buildings into residential, is that going to have any impact on this? And I know that's a far in the future idea, but it is something you guys are working on.
No, absolutely. And it's part of the whole suite of things that we're really doing to revitalize downtown and make sure that it's a thriving place that people want to work in, visit, live in, as you know, on top of many other things that we're doing. The conversion program is one of those, and it won't necessarily impact this. I think, you know, if you're moving from a distressed commercial asset to a residential building, you're being taxed differently. So again, it's really all part of the revitalization effort of downtown for us.
I think that's an important point to note is that if you do these residential conversions, so because of that difference in the residential versus commercial real estate rate, you need like more than 2 square feet of residential to replace every square foot of commercial that you're losing in terms of taxable income. So as you convert these commercial buildings into residential buildings, you're actually losing an enormous amount of revenue. And then on top of that, you know, the current program that's being offered, there's like a big, they're giving them a big reduced tax rate on top of what they're already doing. So that was really like the big thing that people should take away from the report, is just that the whole city in Boston and I think in Massachusetts needs to figure out how we're going to move forward in an era when we just can't rely on like continuous commercial growth to fund local budgets.
Running low on time, but Ashley, yep.
I just want to, I can't stress enough, I think it's really important for us to understand that when we're talking about losing revenue, it's a redistribution of who is paying the taxes. So I want to make it really clear that we are not expecting to lose $1 billion of revenue in the next couple of years. We whether or not this measure passes or not, we are still going to collect the same amount of revenue and still be able to provide the critical city services that we provide in the city. So I think it's really important to note we are really just seeking to give ourselves some runway to absorb that change.
Ashley Groffenberger and Greg Maynard, thanks so much for your time from both of you. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.